A man stands in chains in front of the ruling council of his nation, and in a single sentence he turns the room against itself. The man is Paul. The place is Jerusalem, sometime around the year 57 AD. He has been dragged out of the temple by a mob, nearly beaten to death, pulled to safety by Roman soldiers, and now set in front of the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of the Jews, 71 men who are supposed to judge him. He has one look at the faces in front of him. He knows these men. He was trained among them. And he sees, in the seats of the council, that the men who hold his life in their hands are not one body. They are two. So he says one thing. Brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope of the resurrection of the dead. The book of Acts records what happens next in a single line. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The council that had gathered to condemn him splits down the middle and begins to argue with itself. Some of the scribes stand up and shout that they find nothing wrong with him. Others shout back. The argument becomes physical. The Roman commander, watching from the side, becomes afraid that Paul will be torn to pieces in the struggle, and he sends soldiers down into the council chamber to pull the prisoner out by force before the men judging him kill him by accident. Paul has done this on purpose. He knows the fault line that runs through that room, and he has stepped on it. Because the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, no angel, no spirit. The Pharisees confess all three. And the gap between those two convictions is wide enough that a man on trial for his life can hide in it. This is the world Jesus walked through. Not a single Judaism with a single set of beliefs, but a nation divided into rival camps that disagreed about the most basic questions a religion can ask. What happens when you die? Whether God has spoken since Moses, whether the dead will rise, whether to fight Rome or wait. These were not academic disputes. Men organized their whole lives around the answers, and in the end, men killed and died for them. We are going to meet the four great movements of first-century Judaism as they actually were. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the one Josephus calls the fourth philosophy, the movement of the sword. By the time we are finished, you will understand why these four camps agreed on almost nothing, and why, in the spring of 33 AD, groups that despised one another found themselves on the same side against the same man. The four movements did not fall out of the sky. They grew out of a wound, and we have spent the last 2 episodes inside that wound. A Greek king had tried to erase the Jewish faith. He put a pagan altar in the temple, outlawed circumcision, burned the Torah scrolls, and forced the question every Jew in Judea now had to answer. What do you do when the world tells you to stop being what God made you? A priest's family in a village called Modain answered with the sword and drove the Greeks out. But the victory did not heal the wound. It exposed it. Because the people who came out the other side of the persecution did not agree on what the rescue had meant, or on what faithfulness required now that the danger had passed. Some had run to the Greek gymnasium and tried to become Greeks. Some had stood in the villages and died rather than eat the king's pork. Some had taken up arms. Some had decided the whole temple was now polluted and walked away into the desert. The crisis had sorted the nation into kinds, and over the century that followed, those kinds hardened into parties. By the time a Galilean teacher walked into the temple courts in the reign of Tiberius, the sorting was complete. Almost everything we know about how it looked from the outside comes from one man, and we have met him before. Josephus, a Jewish aristocrat, a priest by birth, a general in the war against Rome who surrendered and went over to the Roman side, and spent the rest of his life writing the history of his people for a Roman audience. Josephus describes the movements as philosophies. the word a Greek would use for competing schools of thought, like the Stoics or the Epicureans. He does this deliberately because he is explaining Judaism to Romans who understood philosophy and did not understand Judaism, and he counts them. 3, he says, in most of his accounts: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. Then, in his later and longer history, he adds a 4th, the movement of armed resistance, which he holds responsible for the war that destroyed the nation. That count is worth a closer look, because it tells us something about Josephus before it tells us anything about the sects. In 4 separate places, he names only 3 philosophies. In one place he names 4. Some modern scholars have argued that the 4th philosophy is partly Josephus's own construction, a category he built to give the war a single source he could blame, a faction conveniently distant from the priestly circles he himself came from. Josephus had every reason to want the catastrophe of 70 AD to have one clear author, and that author was never going to be men like him. So when we read his 4, we are reading history through a man writing his own defense. We will keep that in mind. The fault lines he describes are real. The frame he puts around them is his own. Start with the largest, the Pharisees. The name probably comes from a Hebrew word meaning the separated ones, though even that is uncertain, and it may have begun as an insult before it became a badge. They were not priests. That is the first thing to understand about them, and the most important. The Pharisees were laymen, craftsmen, merchants, teachers, the leaders of the local synagogues. Their authority did not come from their birth or from any office in the temple. It came from what they knew. What they knew was the Torah, and something they believed came with it. The Pharisees held that when God gave Moses the written law on Sinai, he also gave an oral law alongside it, a body of interpretation and application handed down by word of mouth, from teacher to student, across the generations. The written Torah says to keep the Sabbath holy. It does not say what counts as work. The oral law answered the question. It built, in their own phrase, a fence around the law, a hedge of additional rules whose purpose was to keep a person so far from breaking a commandment that they could not even approach the line. If the Torah is a cliff, the oral law is the railing set back from the edge. This was the engine of Pharisaic life, and it produced an entire culture of debate. By the time of Jesus, the Pharisees were split between 2 great schools, named for 2 teachers who had lived a generation before him: the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. Shammai was the strict one. When a Gentile came to him and asked to be taught the whole Torah while standing on 1 foot, Shammai drove him off with a builder's measuring rod. Hillel was the gentle one. When the same Gentile came to him with the same demand, Hillel said, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. You will recognize the shape of that answer, because a teacher from Galilee would give a version of it as the summary of the law and the prophets, phrased not as a prohibition, but as a command. Do to others what you would have them do to you. The Pharisees and Jesus were working the same material, in the same way, arguing the same questions. This is the fact that the centuries have buried under caricature, and it has to be dug back out. Because the Pharisees come down to us as the villains of the Gospels, the hypocrites, the whitewashed tombs, the men who tithe their garden herbs and neglect justice and mercy. And those rebukes are in the text, and they are sharp, and they are real. But they are an argument inside a family, not an attack from outside one. Of all the movements in first-century Judaism, Jesus was closest to the Pharisees. He believed, as they did, in the resurrection of the dead, in angels, in a God who acts in history toward a purpose, He debated the way they debated, question against question, text against text. He was invited to their tables and went. When he was asked whether divorce was lawful for any cause, he was being asked to take a side in a live dispute between Hillel and Shammai, and he answered like a man who knew exactly which school he was correcting. And some of them followed him. Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, came to him by night with a question and came back at his death with 100 pounds of spices for the burial. A group of Pharisees once came to warn him that Herod wanted him dead and told him to flee. Paul, the man who split the Sanhedrin, was a Pharisee, trained by Gamaliel, who was the grandson of Hillel himself. The movement that produced the fiercest opponents of Jesus also produced some of his defenders, and it is a flattening of the history and a slander against a whole people to remember only the half that fought him. The conflict was real, but it was the conflict of nearness, not distance. Jesus attacked the Pharisees the way you attack the people whose project is closest to your own and who you believe have gone wrong at the center of it. His charge was not that they kept the law. It was that they had built the fence so high they had walled out the thing the law was for. They had made the tradition of men into a burden laid on other men's backs and forgotten mercy. That is an argument about how to be faithful between two parties who both intended to be. It is not the argument of a man against a religion he stood outside. The Pharisees mattered more than their numbers because the people were with them. Josephus says so plainly, and that popular authority is why they are the only one of the four movements that survived what was coming. The Pharisee did not need the temple. He needed a scroll, a synagogue, and a question. When the temple burned in 70 AD, the Sadducees who ran it vanished. The Essenes in the desert were slaughtered. The men of the sword were crushed. But the Pharisee still had everything that had ever made him a Pharisee. The Judaism that rebuilt itself after the catastrophe. The Judaism of the rabbis, of the Mishnah and the Talmud, of the synagogue that is still the center of Jewish life today, is the direct descendant of the Pharisees. They lost the argument with Jesus in the Christian telling. They won the argument with history. Their way of being Jewish is the one that outlasted the fire. Now the men who ran the temple? The Sadducees. If the Pharisees were the party of the people, the Sadducees were the party of the establishment. The name probably traces back to Zadok, the high priest in the days of Solomon, and that origin tells you who they were. They were the priestly aristocracy, the families that held the high priesthood, that administered the temple and its treasury, that sat at the top of the social order in Jerusalem. They were wealthy. They were powerful, and their power was bound to one building. Their theology fit their position exactly, which is a thing that happens more often than the comfortable like to admit. The Sadducees accepted only the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses. They rejected the oral law of the Pharisees entirely. And they rejected the new doctrines that had grown up in the silent centuries, the beliefs that are not spelled out plainly in the 5 books. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe in a coming judgment that would reverse the order of the world. According to the book of Acts, they did not believe in angels or spirits. Think about that. The Sadducees were the men with the most to lose from any claim that the present arrangement of the world was temporary. They held the wealth, the offices, the working relationship with Rome that kept them in both. A theology of resurrection and judgment is a theology in which the powerful are not safe, in which the present order is not final, in which God is about to overturn the board. The Sadducees did not believe the board would be overturned. They believed the task was to manage the present, protect the temple, keep the peace with Rome, and maintain the system that kept them at the top of it. Their doctrine asked nothing of them that their position did not already want. The men who hold power rarely believe the world is about to end. This is the group that the Gospels place at the center of the plot against Jesus. The chief priests who move against him are Sadducees. Caiaphas, the high priest who presides over the night hearing, is a Sadducee. And their motive, in the texts, is not theological in the way the Pharisees' disputes were theological. It is institutional. As Jesus draws larger crowds, the chief priests convene the council, and the reason the Gospel of John gives for their fear is bluntly political. If we let him go on, they say, the whole nation will follow him, and the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Then Caiaphas speaks. It is better, he tells them, that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He is not debating the resurrection. He is protecting the building and the arrangement and himself. But John stops the narrative cold to point at what the high priest has just said. He did not say this on his own, John writes. As high priest that year, he was prophesying that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but to gather into one the scattered children of God. Read it again and feel the irony close like a trap. Caiaphas means it as cold political arithmetic. One death is cheaper than a war. Sacrifice the troublemaker, save the institution. And in the act of reducing Jesus to an expendable problem, he states exactly the thing the early church would proclaim as the center of everything. One man dies for the people. One man dies so the nation does not perish. One man dies to gather the scattered children of God into one. The high priest of the temple, defending the temple, opens his mouth to justify a murder, and the doctrine of the atonement comes out. He is the last man in Jerusalem who would have wanted to say it, and his office made him say it anyway. The man whose whole concern was the building became, without knowing it, the one who announced what the true temple would be. There is a single scene in the Gospels where the Sadducees come to Jesus on their own ground, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is the clearest window we have into the fault line that ran through the nation. They come to him with a riddle, and the riddle is designed to make the resurrection look ridiculous. A woman marries 7 brothers in turn, each one dying and passing her to the next, as the law of Moses requires. In the resurrection, they ask, whose wife will she be? They have all had her. The question is a trap built out of the only scripture they accept, the books of Moses, and it is meant to show that the whole idea of resurrection collapses into absurdity the moment you take it seriously. Jesus does not argue around the edges. He goes to the center. You are wrong, he tells them, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. In the resurrection, people do not marry. They are like the angels. And then he does something precise. He meets them on their own ground, inside the books of Moses they accept, and the Pharisees and he both build on. Have you not read, he says, what God said to Moses at the burning bush? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And then the hinge of the whole argument. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. God spoke those words to Moses centuries after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died. And he did not say, I was their God. He said, I am. The patriarchs are not gone. To the God who stands outside of time, they are alive. The resurrection is not a foreign doctrine smuggled in from somewhere. It was hidden inside the grammar of a sentence God spoke at the bush, waiting to be read. The Sadducees have no answer, and the reason this scene matters for everything that follows is that it shows what Jesus was claiming the authority to do. He was not just taking the Pharisees' side against the Sadducees in an existing debate. he was claiming to settle it, to read the mind of God in the Scriptures more truly than the men whose whole lives were the Scriptures. That is a claim about who he is, made in passing in the middle of a trap. And the men who run the temple hear it. The third movement you will not find in the Gospels at all. The Essenes, not one named encounter. No Essene comes to question Jesus, argues with him on the road, sits at his table, or stands in the council against him. They are the great absence in the New Testament, and yet, by an accident of preservation, they are the group we can now see more clearly than any of the others. Because the Essenes, or a community very much like them, left a library, and in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave above the Dead Sea and heard pottery break, and the library began to come back into the light. We will give that library its own episode. For now, understand who these people were and why they had vanished from the conversation that the Gospels record. The Essenes had looked at the same temple the Sadducees ran and the Pharisees frequented, and they had concluded it was defiled beyond repair. The wrong priests stood at the altar. The calendar by which the festivals were kept was, in their view, miscalculated, so that all Israel was holding its holy days on the wrong days. The whole apparatus of the nation's worship was corrupt, and a faithful man could not take part in it without being corrupted himself. So they left. They withdrew from the argument entirely. Some lived in towns across Judea in disciplined communities, holding their property in common, sharing meals, refusing oaths, living by Josephus's account in a strictness that impressed even him. The most famous group of them went out to the cliffs above the Dead Sea, to a settlement we call Qumran, and built there what they understood to be the true Israel in exile. They kept their own calendar. They wrote their own commentaries on the prophets, reading the ancient texts as coded descriptions of their own community and their own enemies. They washed themselves constantly in ritual baths, preparing their bodies for a holiness the rest of the nation had abandoned. And they waited. What they waited for was the end. The Essenes were apocalyptic to the core. They believed they were living in the last days, that history was about to reach its hinge, that God was about to break in and end the present age in a final battle. They wrote a document we call the War Scroll, which lays out in tactical detail the last war between the sons of light, who were themselves, and the sons of darkness, who were everyone else, including most of their fellow Jews. They expected to win that war because God and his angels would fight on their side. They were, in their own understanding, the faithful remnant, the last true Israel, holding the line in the desert until the world they were promised arrived. It did not arrive the way they expected. When the war against Rome finally came in 66 AD, it was not the war of the scroll. The Romans came up the valley, and the community at Qumran was destroyed. And the people who had waited in the desert for the end of the world met instead the end of themselves. But before they died, they hid their library in the caves, and the scrolls waited in the dark for 19 centuries. And what they tell us about the world Jesus was born into is the subject of the next episode. For now, hold this. The Essenes are the movement that answered the crisis by leaving. Where the Pharisees said, "Be faithful in the synagogue and wait," and the Sadducees said, "Manage the temple and keep the peace," the Essenes said, "The whole thing is lost. Come out from among them and prepare for the end." 3 answers already to the single question the persecution had forced. And 1 more to come, the most dangerous of the 4. The 4th movement carried a knife. Josephus calls it the 4th philosophy, and he traces it to a specific man at a specific moment. In the year 6 AD, when Rome imposed direct rule on Judea and ordered a census so that the new province could be taxed. A man named Judas of Galilee rose up and called the census what he believed it was: apostasy. To enroll your name in a Roman tax register, Judas taught, was to accept Caesar as your master, and the Jews had no master but God. To pay the tribute was to deny the kingship of God over Israel. There could be no accommodation, no middle path, no quiet submission while you waited for God to act. God's kingship was not a future hope. It was a present fact, and a present fact demanded a present refusal. Josephus says this movement agreed with the Pharisees on nearly every point of belief. The same God, the same law, the same hope of resurrection. What set it apart was a single conviction held with absolute ferocity. An inviolable attachment to liberty, Josephus calls it. A refusal to call any man Lord, and a willingness to die, and to watch their families die, rather than submit. Where the Pharisee said, "Wait and obey the law," the man of the fourth philosophy said, "The time for waiting is over." And obedience to God means resistance to Rome, with the sword, if it comes to the sword. A word of historical honesty here, because it matters, and the popular accounts usually skip it. We tend to call this movement the Zealots, and to picture an organized party operating throughout the 1st century. The evidence is murkier than that. The formal faction that called itself the Zealots seems to have crystallized only during the war itself, around 68 AD, decades after Jesus. And there was a related group, the Sicarii, the daggermen, named for the short curved blades they hid under their cloaks, who would slip through the festival crowds, knife a Roman collaborator in the press of bodies, and vanish into the panic before anyone knew a man was down. Whether all of these were one movement or several overlapping ones, whether zealot in the time of Jesus meant a card-carrying member of a party or simply a man consumed with zeal for God and the law, the sources do not let us say for certain. What is certain is that the disposition was real and present in Jesus' lifetime. The conviction that faithfulness meant the sword, that God would honor the man who fought and not the man who waited. And here the four movements stop being a catalog and become a story. Because Jesus reached into this exact world, this nation sorted into rival camps that despised one another. And he built his inner circle out of men drawn from across the fault lines. He called a tax collector. Matthew sat at a booth collecting Rome's tolls, which made him, in the eyes of every faithful Jew, a traitor twice over. A man who took his own people's money for the occupier and skimmed his living off the top. And Jesus also called a man, the Gospel's name, Simon the Zealot. Set those two names side by side and feel what they meant in that world. The Zealots, or the men of that disposition, did not merely dislike tax collectors. They killed them. A tax collector was exactly the kind of collaborator a dagger man would target in a crowd. Jesus took a man who collected for Rome and a man whose movement assassinated men who collected for Rome. And he put them in the same group of 12 and told them to love one another and sent them out together to carry the same message. There is no natural world in which Matthew and Simon are on the same side. The only thing that could possibly hold them in one room is a loyalty higher than the loyalties that divided them. A person who mattered more than the question of Rome, that every other movement had organized itself around. That is the picture the 12 were meant to be. Not a faction. The end of factions. A tax collector and a zealot eating from the same bowl. Because the thing they now had in common was larger than the thing that had made them enemies. Pull back now and see the four together, because the pattern is the point. Each movement was an answer to the same question, the question the 400 years of silence had pressed into the nation, and the Greek persecution had brought to a boil. God has promised. God has not yet acted. What do we do while we wait?" The Pharisee answered, "Keep the law in every detail. Build the fence, and God will act in his time." The Sadducee answered, "There is nothing coming that should unsettle the present. So manage the temple and hold the peace." The Essene answered, "The present is beyond saving. Withdraw, purify, and wait for the end." The man of the sword answered, "The waiting is the sin. Take up the knife and force God's hand." 4 answers. They could not all be right, and the men who held them knew it, and the differences ran deep enough to kill over. The Sadducees and the Pharisees fought over the resurrection. The Essenes had written off the Sadducees' temple as filth. The men of the sword regarded the Sadducees' peace with Rome as treason against God. This was not a nation having a polite disagreement. It was a nation pulled in 4 directions by 4 incompatible visions of what faithfulness required. And the tension among them is the political and spiritual weather of every page of the Gospels. And then a man walked into the middle of it who did not fit any of the 4, and broke all of them. He kept the law more deeply than the Pharisees, and told them their fence had buried its purpose. He honored the temple as his father's house, and told the Sadducees who ran it that it would be torn down and raised in 3 days, and meant his own body. He spoke of the end of the age like an Essene, and refused to withdraw, and went straight to the tables of the tax collectors and the sinners the Essenes had fled. He was called a king, which is what the men of the sword were waiting for. And when they came to take him by force and make him that king, he withdrew from them. And when one of his own drew a sword to defend him, he told the man to put it away, and healed the man it had wounded. Every movement had a category, and he stepped out of all of them. That is why the question is not which sect Jesus belonged to. He belonged to none. The deeper claim the Gospels are making is that the 4 sects were 4 ways of waiting, and he was the arrival. Every one of them had organized itself around the gap between the promise and its fulfillment, the silence the nation had lived inside for 400 years. The Pharisee filled the gap with study. The Sadducee denied the gap mattered. The Essene fled into the gap. The man of the sword tried to close the gap by force. And the claim at the center of the gospel is that the gap had closed, that the one they were all waiting for in their different broken ways was standing in the temple courts arguing with them, and that none of them recognized him, because he had not come in any of the 4 shapes they had prepared. Which brings us to the spring of 33 AD, and to the thing that should be impossible. The men who arrested Jesus and handed him to Pilate were Sadducees, the chief priests, protecting their temple and their arrangement with Rome. But the crowd that the Gospels say turned against him included men shaped by every current in the nation. The Pharisees, who had fought him over the law, are named among his opponents. The political charge that sent him to the cross, that he claimed to be a king, was the charge that played on the fear of Rome that the men of the sword had inflamed for 60 years. The Sadducees needed Rome calm. The Pharisees thought him a blasphemer. The disposition of the Zealots had made any talk of a king of the Jews into a lit fuse. Groups that agreed on nothing, that fought one another over the resurrection and the temple and the sword, found, for 1 week, a thing they could agree on: this man. It is one of the strange unities of history, and the Gospels do not look away from it. Even Pilate and Herod Antipas, the Gospel of Luke notes, who had been enemies, became friends that day. Reconciled over the body of a Galilean neither of them wanted to deal with. The divided nation, the divided council, the divided empire. Briefly undivided, around the single question of what to do with him. The fractures the persecution had opened 200 years earlier closed for 1 moment, and what closed them was a common verdict against one man. What does it mean that the thing the divided could finally agree on was his death? The early church gave it an answer that the centuries have not exhausted. It means that he stood outside every faction because he stood above all of them, and that the world's deepest divisions are not healed by adding a fifth party to the four. They are healed by a person the parties cannot contain, who absorbs the hostility of all of them into himself and gives back something none of them were offering. The tax collector and the zealot did not stop being a tax collector and a zealot by finding a compromise between Rome and the sword. They stopped by following the same Lord. The thing that unites is never a better argument. It is always a greater allegiance. The four movements each had an answer to the silence, a way of waiting for God to act. Each of them was, in its own way, sincere, and each of them missed him when he came. When you imagine yourself in that world, which of the four do you think you would have been? The careful keeper of the law, the manager of the peace, the one who fled to the desert, or the one who reached for the sword? And which of their blind spots do you think you would have shared? Let me know in the comments. The Essenes are the movement we passed over quickest, and it is the wrong way around, because they are the one we can now see best. For 19 centuries, they were a few sentences in Josephus and Pliny, a withdrawn and celibate people somewhere near the Dead Sea, easy to forget. Then a shepherd looking for a lost goat threw a rock into a cave on a cliff face above the shore and heard the sound of a jar shattering and climbed up to find the first of the scrolls. What came out of those caves over the next decade is the greatest manuscript discovery in the history of the Bible, a whole library from the world of the four sects, copied and hidden by men who believed they were the last faithful Israel and that the end of all things was near. Their own rule book, their own hymns, their own battle plan for the war between light and darkness, and copies of the Hebrew scriptures 1,000 years older than any that had survived before. That is the next episode, the Dead Sea Scrolls, what Qumran actually tells us. If you do not want to miss it, subscribe.